Welcome back to JFK Values, everybody. We're going to get started shortly. We have a special guest today that we're getting ready to bring in and, I don't know, have a series of arguments with. All right. Let's see. All right. We are recording. Welcome back to JFK Values, everybody. This is Peter's show, technically. Or he convinced me to do this. I'm your host, James Felton. This is a show about critiquing other people's values and how they get in the way of us distributing actual value to the people who need it and or are owed it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As always, this show is brought to you by the Keith Institute, and this is another inclusionism podcast where we like to say individuals are at their best when they identify with the community, and of course, communities are only keyword at their best when they identify all of their individuals. I'm here as usual with Peter Williamson, but we have another face on the screen, another guest here, Reginald Greene. Educator, attorney, man of mystery, all of those things. We're going to do a deep dive and put some bios in the link to basically piggyback on the conversation that we've been having for about 30 minutes before we got on the air, as I got a call from Reg. But before we get there, before we get into any of this chaos, morning, Peter. How's it going? Where's
I'm good.
On camera?
She's right. I don't know if you could see me being sort of looking like I'm petting behind me. That's because she's sitting right behind me on my chair, hanging out, just being her crazy self.
That part, right?
She'll show up, Reg, at some point on camera pretty soon, probably. She likes to be a star.
And Reg, how should we introduce? How do you? Peter and I were talking about this. Peter's got a bunch of education questions. Again, for anyone who's not familiar with my rants, there are two things I am wildly ignorant about: the education system and anything with regards to healthcare, actual healthcare. All those 8-syllable words that mean things. I get healthcare in general from a financial standpoint, but I don't know how it works in the body. I have a classical male neglect for myself. I'm fortunate to be married, so I don't take care of me. But anyway, but Reg is the subject matter expert in at least the education field. But I think about you as a lawyer. So how do you identify professionally? Is that good language?
I think it's appropriate language. I mean, I have always got my 90-second elevator pitch because my career is so multifaceted. Most people pick a strain, they stay in it, they go. I always wanted to be a Renaissance man. So growing up in Paducah, Kentucky, which is far away from the Renaissance as you can get, I knew that I wanted to be able to take large pieces of information that are critically important to the success of people in our society, distill that into bite-sized chunks so that I can create comedy, collaboration, and execution of a plan towards success. That's what I knew I wanted to do as a kid. And I thought to do that, I should be a lawyer. I felt like lawyers are the ones who create the law. They say what things mean. And then from there, conversations can occur. And along the way, I ended up doing Teach for America, became a teacher, realized that all you really do as a lawyer is try to take large pieces of information and distill it to a small group. But to do so effectively, you need to know how to teach people how to listen and how to bring them along in the journey. And so education is what I did for about 12 years, from Teach for America core member all the way through to a superintendent of a cluster of charter schools in LA. I taught in Miami, I taught in Chicago, I taught in New York and Los Angeles. So I got all the major places. I was a teacher, administrator, and then I went to law school and became a prosecutor because that was the other bureaucratic system that defines people, defines things that are critically important to our society.
Yeah.
And then those are lawyers who make that decision. And there are not many Black lawyers making those decisions. And I felt that I should be one of those. And now I'm still a lawyer, but I settle disputes without people going to jail. And so the way I settle disputes is I work as a mediator. That means I help sophisticated entities settle cases. So my grand sweep from small town in Paducah, Kentucky to the best city in the world, New York City, is I solve problems by taking information that's critically important for us to understand and have that conversation and help people get to a solution. And as a mediator, I get to do that with sophisticated entities like Fortune 500 companies or startups or institutions that are involved in pensions or retirements, and I help them settle whenever they're being sued. I do that along with my leader and the one of the best mediators in the country, Jeb Melnick, who's the owner and board member at JAMS, which is Judicial Arbitration Mediation Services. So I work on the Melnick team there.
I think, anyway, we won't get into the institution you all work for, because I feel like you all created you all institutionalized mediation, which is, I want to get into a broader conversation later, but I don't know if we'll have time here. We'll probably have to have you on multiple times to touch on everything. But as of late, I've been talking to people, here in America about our institutions and our trust in our institutions, or rather our lack of trust in our institutions, and how institutions get created through subject matter expertise or agreements or arguments or caucusing of subject matter experts. But how fragile some of that stuff is, like the legal system, like laws and regulations that people, I think, take for granted or think are normal. This week I was sort of reeling from news that various state legislatures, Idaho in particular, as I have some colleagues out in Moscow, Idaho, that is a city in Idaho, not Moscow in Russia, but that the legislature in Idaho is getting ready to target the Supreme Court to eliminate same-sex marriages, which obviously impacts me. I'm in a same-sex marriage and was an active participant in the court case that went to one of the court cases that went to the Supreme Court to affirm same-sex marriage, at least the one out of Michigan. If people are not familiar, there were 3 of them. I think Michigan, Tennessee, and I'm forgetting a third state. But I was running 10 years ago the LGBT Chamber of Commerce, and I remember being at the Keith Center, different than the Keith Institute, named after my grandfather's cousin, Damon Keith, who was a lawyer, and that center is tied to Wayne State University. I remember being there with Dana Nessel, who is now the Attorney General in Michigan. She was I don't know the right language, prosecutor, litigator, whatever. She was the lawyer for one of the couples, at least the one in Michigan, that went to the Supreme Court to make the case for same-sex marriage. And 10 years ago, I thought this was over. I thought it was old news. And we move on to the next thing and keep stacking institutional infrastructure on top of that particular institution. And now it's all potentially in question again. So I think it's interesting that you, Reg, work for, the work that you do with JAMS and in general, or in mediating in general, is a proxy of, an institution that a few lawyers over time kind of, I think, as outsiders would look upon it and say, you all made it up. And I spend a lot of time in my work at Inclusion School and elsewhere talking about how institutions are established and scaled. And so anyway, I didn't realize I was going to say that at all. You just made me think about that, and I've gone on a rant. Peter, please.
Well, I was going to just jump in and say this actually, just listening to both of you discuss these two topics kind of brings us back to a little bit to where we were at the end of last week's show, talking about resentment and how resentment distorts people's ability to properly evaluate value and how maybe resentment is or is not sort of, I don't like to use the word inherent, but maybe it's a very frequently occurring human value that we seem to have, that we resent when others have things, even if it doesn't necessarily directly impact us. Something like trying to repeal same-sex marriage doesn't have anything to do with anybody else's marriage or state of life or well-being or anything like that, but people still seem to want to stick their foot into the lives of others. And then I guess also then throwing it a little bit to Reg as well, so both of you can speak on this, is as a mediator, how do you deal with when one party brings an element of resentment into a case that is distorting potentially their ability to see a clear value, determination about what a claim is or is not worth? And how do you distill, because it's not information, that's distilling sort of human emotion and human, just reaction into something that more closely resembles a value equation. So I guess leave that up to everybody.
I would say the mediation I do is complex commercial mediation.
Sure.
And so, that is very different from, let's say, divorce mediation, where I think the crux of divorce mediation is a deep sense of resentment. I mean, a partnership is failed, and it's failed not on a business standard, but it's failed personally. Whereas commercial complex, you have sophisticated entities. I mean, I'm not typically talking to a person that's aggrieved personally. I'm talking to an institution with actors and directors and board members who may have had personal stakes, and it can get personal when you have smaller companies where their family's on the board and they're being sued by their shareholders. Sure, all disputes are steeped in resentment. I mean, there's some form of it, but the more sophisticated the entities, the more removed they are from personal interaction, and it's more on a business interaction, the more likely it is that resentment will not surface as the make or break moment, right? The make or break moment is going to be the dollars. And to your point, how do you value that? Mediators try to find where the parties are signaling they want things to go. That's our job. We're not therapists in that sense. We're not trying to figure out what broke between the parties. We're trying to figure out how do we settle the dispute the parties had. And sometimes you have to dig into the resentments that are underlying it, but most of the time you're trying to understand the value they are giving to the case. How much are they willing to spend to end the resentment?
I hear you. I get it. The more sophisticated entity that's in the dispute, the better for mediation. But okay, let's extrapolate this out a bit to modern politics, because we have sophisticated influencers influencing people who are not very sophisticated, people who may not necessarily be able to manage their interpersonal relationships, to have a certain level of resentment to their neighbors, to thy neighbor, who are getting access to resources, infrastructure, whether it be social, economic, technological, you name it. And they're sort of, I think, fueling the flames of resentment for political gain. And I say this as I think we are all, let me step back for a minute. I think this is really interesting. So we're all married. What, Peter, how long have you been married? How many years?
6.5.
6.5 years. I've been married 12 years. Rich, how long have you been married?
14. It'll be 15 this summer.
All right. So this is bad. I don't even know if we should go into this on a podcast, but I think something should be said. And all my single people are gonna hate this, but I think something should be said about folks that are able to, sustain long-term, relationships. We obviously, I just compromised earlier on a garbage can. I don't know. I compromise regularly on dishes, things like that. I always tell people go, what's the secret to staying married? And I was like, being willing to do, at least in my household, a fair share of dishes. And for me, that doesn't mean 50% of dishes. That means I need to be able to do like 20-25% of the dishes. So our ability to, I don't think, if the majority of the population is not, holding together these type of long-term relationships that we are, whether they're intimate romantic. I think it's a tall order to ask folks to, be able to sustain relationships in a professional or political or social way. I don't know. Do you all have any opinions on that? Am I going too far suggesting that people can't participate well in society because they're not married? Oh my God, I can't believe I just said that. I'm thinking out loud.
I want to make sure to clarify, lawyers do.
Yes, be the lawyer.
A term.
Yeah.
When I say sophisticated, and this relates to your point,
Ooh.
I don't mean intelligence. I don't mean money necessarily. Sophisticated means how many degrees of separation you have from the means of production, how far you're separated from the dispute itself. So larger institutions have a bunch of people in the middle between the transaction and the leader. They have a lot of separation between the product and the boardroom. And when you're in a marriage dispute, there is no separation. So that is, quote, less sophisticated. There's less stuff in between to stop you from talking directly. Whereas larger institutions have a bunch of things in between them to keep them separated. So you can hide, you can hide your signals better because you're separated. So that's what makes it sophisticated.
What about an argument inside of an organization between multiple stakeholders in that organization, whether they're shareholders, employees, you name it? I mean, you just got me. I'm just noodling as you clarify. So disputes, not that these are some of your direct cases, right? But just consider this from in the same institution, two parties who have an invested stake in the institution, but they're in a dispute about how assets, how resources, how priorities should be divided up. I mean, I feel like these are arguments. When I talk to corporations, we don't mediate. I try to implement strategies, business process to be deliberately inclusive to people across large, complex organizations. We were just talking to a 25,000 person organization this week about how to incentivize deliberately including people. And it really came down to how they consider people's values in that organization before they roll out new products and services. And even though I don't wash 75% of the dishes in my house because I'm elect to let them pile up a bit before I get them all, I like to get them in bulk. Whereas Andy, my husband, for anyone who's not familiar, he want to wash them every time he see him. And I just feel like it's inefficient use of resources. So if we make that about some of these more corporate arguments that we see, I mean, what do you think about that? Are there any similarities there? Or I don't know. Am I off? I'm way down a rabbit hole. Sorry, Peter. I know we had other ways we wanted to go here.
I think you're hitting on something that's crucial to all disputes and a resolution of disputes. It's about what it means to the person. And so, in your particular household, it's dishes, it's garbage collection, it's theories on efficiency. For Andy, it might be, hey, my mental space has value. And when there are dishes, it equals X, which is higher than the value of Y, which is your analysis of efficiency. But because you are connected, you're in the same household, right? You share funds, you've been together for a long time. You can have that direct conversation about those things and negotiate hand in hand. You likely don't need a mediator. But sophisticated entities, even if they're internal discussions, there's an impact on the shareholder bottom line if this particular employee sues or starts a union. Then there's a public perception of them starting a union. So the more factors and more people who are involved, that means there's more values and more stakes that have to be negotiated to get to a resolution. And that's what makes it more complicated. The more direct the communication can be, the less complicated the stakes may be. But the more people you have involved, the higher stakes get, because you have to figure out what everybody's signals are. What do they value, and what are they signaling is their threshold for the value of that asset or need or whatever, versus the other person's And then the more persons, the more complicated it is.
No, yeah, you're right. Look, I think about perception too, because we talked about if we should get a house cleaner or something. All these apps, they do it inexpensively, and I'm like, but who are we? We live in a box. I'm at home. For anyone not familiar, in the background, it may look like it's nice over here, and it's decent. We got sunlight. I have on literal sunglasses, but we live in a box. I'm like, who are we if we are the kind of people to have someone come in and help us wash the dishes? Like I'd be embarrassed by that. I'd be embarrassed by that interpretation. But you're right. If there were more people, more infrastructure here, they're incentivized to ensure that we don't make those decisions unilaterally. Then yeah, it becomes more, I think, to use your word, sophisticated. I think perception and communication and considering people's values is at play all the time, whether you're in a big complex organization or a community of two. But that said, about the complexity of communication and actors at the table, I'm bringing that new word in, actors at the table, but maybe I shouldn't just say entities at the table. I think, Peter, you'll like this. So Reg and I were talking before we got on about, and Reg, I'll let you explain it because I'm not sure if Peter has seen it. Peter, have you seen the Michael Steele interview where he was on a panel? If anyone's not familiar, Michael Steele is the former Republican National Committee chair. He's a former lieutenant governor from, I think, Virginia, Maryland, one of those states down there. Mm-hmm. And was on Morning Joe, which was run by Joe Scarborough and
Mika Brzezinski.
And Mika, right, who is now his wife, which is an interesting internal workplace thing. And they were having a back and forth. Peter, you familiar with this?
I haven't seen this particular one, but I've seen Michael Steele given some unusual interviews of late, so not surprised.
Reg, so before we got on, everybody, so Reg called me about this particular thing, but I think this goes into what we're talking about with families and companies and more actors, more communications, more entities at the table, and the relative complexity it insists upon. I think when we extrapolate out into a really large community like our political society, we get into this, I think, interesting conversation, which is why we're even here doing this radio show podcast, is because Peter's like, we need to have the conversation. We're not being a part of the conversation. And I'm like, should we be a part of the conversation? Should we be talking about people's values? Should we just shut up and hide under the bed and go to sleep? Or should I let my anxiety kind of run over me and never do anything ever again? And obviously, Peter's like, no. So we're in this space where we have a lot of noise, or I'm just going to call it noise, but I probably shouldn't. A lot of communicators with opinions about the status of the world, the status of America, the status of our local towns and states. And we have to consider what's valid, what's not, and what we include in our decision making about the institutions that we build going forward tomorrow. I think the arguments that we have on TV for politics are in line with the arguments that we have in our companies and institutions, and the arguments that we have at our kitchen sinks. That could be naive or too short. But Reg, break down us what Michael Steele and Joe Scarborough were going through, and what's the dude, the gay black dude? I can't remember his name right now.
Well, I mean, that's not a specific descriptor, but in this context, it was Don Lemon.
Bam, Don Lemon. That's what I meant to say. I like Don Lemon. I just saw Don Lemon in June at the Native Son Awards. He was hilarious. Anyway.
Don Lemon was on his podcast, his show.
Yes.
Analyzing the fight that he called it a fight, but basically said Joe was called out by Michael Steele on Morning Joe on his own show. And I think that's like the headline of his episode. Like, sure. Joe and Mika called out on their show.
The headline is controversy. Yeah.
So I was watching that. I didn't see that Morning Joe, but he plays a clip and kind of analyzes not only body language, how people are reacting, what's going on, but the crux of the conversation that was happening on Morning Joe was analyzing the Carter funeral, having Trump with all the former presidents and their spouses, except for Michelle Obama, who didn't show up. And the moment where Barack Obama and him are talking and they're smiling and everyone's reacting to that.
Where Obama and Trump are talking.
Obama and Trump are talking, and the reactions that everyone around it had, from warm and fuzzy feelings of civility and a return to politics as usual, where we can say hateful things to each other, but at the end of the day, we're heads of state and we'll talk, and we're Americans, and this is a funeral, and we're going to do that. Versus how some of the other people were acting at that time. I think Mike Pence's wife did not shake his hand or really acknowledge him very much, or Hillary Rodham Clinton and Bill Clinton going the other way, so they don't even have to like interact with Trump. So there was an analysis of that. And at some point, it said, we have to be civil with, somebody said, I didn't see the whole clip. Somebody said something along the lines, we have to be civil because 78 million people voted for him. And, there needs to be an ability to talk to people because he represents 78 million Americans, and still was kind of combating this idea of civility. He's just like, look, they go two ways. But it's interesting to him in the media and even on that show that morning that there's like a requirement that only one way of the street has to be civil. And so Obama's expected to be civil, even though Trump has never been civil with him in kind. And even in that moment, he's not necessarily being civil because he's not apologizing for what he said in the past. And so he's saying, when you, talking to Joe, say 78 million people voted for him, well, hey, 80 million people voted for Joe Biden, but Trump wasn't civil to him. And so there's this double standard. He didn't say double standard, but he's going down that route, and Joe loses it. Right? He gets very upset. You're twisting my words. I never said anything about 78 million people. I'm not saying that this is the thing. You're saying stuff we already know. We know that Trump isn't civil. That's not the point. The point is, how do we change it? The point is, what do we do about it? And he's like, no, you seem to forget that he wasn't civil when Joe Biden won. You're forgetting that, and that led to a back and forth, very contentious one around words, which distracted from Steele's point. And he gets back to it. Civility is a two-way street. And just because we had that moment that we all enjoyed seeing, it doesn't change the reality of what this administration is going to do on January 20th and moving forward. And that they will not be giving that same civility back to the 74 million people that voted for Kamala Harris. Yeah. And people are watching that and they are feeling things about that. They're feeling like that is incomplete. And that's not fair and it's not right. And we have to address that, not just who's civil and these ideas of old politics. They don't exist anymore. Trump is here and he won. And so it's not the same thing. I'm paraphrasing. This is not what he said. Sure. Through being interrupted. And another panelist, Glazer, gets on there trying to be the diplomat. And Don Lemon makes a big point. She's doing a great job of being a diplomat. And makes an allusion between what's going on now and what happened in the first term of Putin, that a similar thing was happening where conversations of the opposition was, how do we react to him? We need to be better than him. We need to act differently than he is. And yet, while they were having these arguments about civility, he was changing the structures. He was leading it into a fascist state. And now it is where it is now. And there is no conversation about civility. There's no conversation at all outside of what Putin wants you to say or not say, because the structures have been shifted while you were talking about civility.
In those institutions, right. So, but now finish it with, because Peter, I want to know what you think about this, with where Don left off. Because I think so this was Don's critique on the argument that happened on Joe Scarborough's show between him and Michael Steele. So Don's critique was, whether we're civil or not, what the 80 million Bideners and the 77 million Trumpers and the 75 million Harrisers, harassers, think, right? We need to represent those voices. This is the Thanksgiving table argument. I always encourage all of my friends and family, no matter where you are in your mental state, go home and fight people at Thanksgiving, because at the very least, it'll be more entertaining for me. But so where did Don Lemon leave off?
Well, Don steps in and says, well, look, I think this is why legacy media and niche shows have lower ratings or have higher ratings if they have these kind of conversations that he's having with Michael Steele, where you give people who have different opinions, and he makes the point, like, look, Joe probably doesn't like people disagreeing with him on his own show, but he thinks literally it would be better for their ratings and would probably be better in politics for people who are left-leaning to engage in these kind of battles and conversations publicly, because that's what the people want. That's why people are flooding to podcasters or moving away from traditional legacy media, because they're not seeing different perspectives fought over. And without that, it doesn't have the same oomph. It doesn't have the emotional reaction that people need. And that's what Trump taps into. He's doing it. And then he makes a note. That's what AOC taps into. That's what Crawford taps into. And so are they ever going to be standard bearers? Probably not. But if you wanted to combat what is happening in the Trump world and MAGA world with something that represents that 74 million and 80 million, it probably needs to have the same components of emotion, of different perspectives, of not going high when they go low. Because that's not where people are at. They're not really wanting to go high when people go low. They actually want you to go for the jugular. That was like a comment he actually made. He's like, they want you to go high. They want you to go for the jugular. And when you don't do that, you're losing the people. And that's why you see their ratings slipping.
Peter,
yeah, well, I mean, to sort of bring this back to what the original idea of having Reg on and talking about education, what it's making me think about is sort of different historical moments in like the rise of public education in this country and the sort of the purpose that education was supposed to serve at various points. And again, it's not my area of expertise either. I'm just going to be sort of making generalized points about this, but post-Civil War, there is an idea that we need to find some sort of unifying, some kind of unifying structure that will bring back together the warring elements of the United States. And public education is conceived of as one way of, instilling some unifying values about patriotism, but not necessarily what patriotism is. And I'm going to get into this other element here of like this difference between what to think and how to think, that this kind of also makes me think about that there's a lot of voices out there. And I agree with some of the points Reg has made about the necessity to more vociferously argue for what to think. But I also want to kind of make an argument on the side of the how to think, long-term project, because I think that is something that has been missing in a lot of elements of writ large American public education. Very broad brush, not saying this is the case everywhere at all whatsoever, but if you are trying to teach this value of patriotism as a value in and of itself that we should just all ascribe to, without really teaching folks how to think about what patriotism means in one way, the civility thing can be sort of, mapped onto patriotism. It's that there is a proper way to act in sort of public spaces and public, interactions. And it's like, why? So maybe one of the reasons why is if you're getting that in return, if it is a two-way street, then perhaps going back to this sort of dispute resolution, you can, try and have a conversation on the idea of some concrete material values that we disagree on. But if you don't have two parties that are equally sophisticated in their approach to the conflict, if one party is trying to have, this conversation about involving civility and involving sort of how to act in public, and the other side's like, we want to change the world in XYZ ways, as Reg points out, that's a pretty big mismatch. And most of the time you're going to get run over by the folks who are saying we're going to change the world XYZ ways today, and you'll end up in the Putin situation where everyone's like, but civility, what about civility? And it's like, well, too late. That game is no longer being played. Now we're in the material existence game. So good luck to you. So just sort of to try and, I think there's these two long-term projects that are in conflict right now. One is, I do think we need some form of long-term how to think, messaging in education, in public spaces in general. But at the same time, we're in a world right now where it's what to think. Trump is telling you what he thinks, and a lot of people are saying, we agree with this simplified, crazy version of what to think. And the other side's saying, well, what if we tried to meet in the middle, or what if we tried to discuss how we could even begin to have a compromising conversation? Like, what does a compromising conversation look like? And the other side's like, I'm not interested in compromising. This is my values. I'm going with it. Meet me in the street and we'll fight about it, kind of thing. And so you can't ignore the fact that that is the reality of politics. And this was pointed out, this is the direction that media is going in terms of drawing, viewers, drawing, creating value, is that a conflict like a style approach seems to be much more popular right these days. An approach which can be either termed as conflict or it could be termed as what to think. And that's the concern I always bring to it, is that instead of teaching folks through media education, all these things about how to think critically, about how to think, we're just trying to tell them, here's the bottom line, this is what you should think, agree or disagree, pick a side, and let's go. And my concern is always with such a polarizing approach to everything, you always end up in conflict. And just my general approach as a left-leaning person is that overt conflict favors the right wing, because that's basically how they live their life, is that life is a conflict, pick a side and pick up a weapon and let's go to war. And like, generally speaking, I like to think the left's approach is, we can do a lot more with cooperation than we can do with conflict, but we have to teach the skills of cooperation. We have to teach the value of cooperation. And we seem to be in a moment where it's really difficult to make those kind of those lessons stick with people. And, to throw it back to education and to bring it back to the idea of, bringing on a subject matter expert on this area who has worked in a whole lot of different places across this country. Reg, how have you found people's approach to education to be in different places? Is there a standard approach that you find from parents, from administrators? Is it regional? Do people agree on what American education should look like? Is it the same thing as our politics, where it's completely polarized and folks don't agree on anything? I just kind of want to get your sense on that sort of USA-wide picture.
Well, the beauty of working in all those places, and it was an ambition to work in many of the large scale places. I actually saw the exact same thing in Miami, as I saw in Chicago, as I saw in New York, as I saw in LA. Everyone found that their system was failing their children. And if you, just to piggyback on what you said earlier.
Define failing though, because you weren't working in like Paducah or Wetumpka, Alabama, or the middle of New York State. When
that's how they felt. But each place felt that they were failing. Right. Each place was dealing with the same issues of kids coming to school, not having eaten.
Miami, Chicago, LA.
Yes.
New York.
They all came to this place with kids who are drastically behind, kids on par, and kids ahead on some kind of bell curve. And all of them are, objectives-based learning. Standardized testing is at the core of each of these places. And everyone felt like their kids weren't getting a fair shake. Even the kids who are on top of the scores were like, well, I'd be doing better if those kids weren't disrupting the class. The kids on the bottom were like, well, I'd be doing better if I had housing, if I had security, if there wasn't violence happening in my home. The kids in the middle was like, nobody focuses on me, because it's either the top flying kids or the kids who are really doing poorly who get all the attention. And the administrators and teachers in all of these spaces were like, I don't have the resources and the vision that is given to me. You must get these test scores, does not align with, to your point, Peter, how to learn. How to learn is not really, you can't assess that on a single test. It is a process over 12 years of education, how to learn. But the core of the problem in our country that I've seen over those 12 years was the reason for that public education system, which really didn't get codified until after the Civil War, was for the purposes of having a literate electorate. It was just to have people literate, to know civics on like a basic level, like how to vote, because they realize, okay, now people are going to start voting. And 3, to make sure that these people went to work. And so having a school system where kids go somewhere, they're learning how to read and write, that gives their parents the ability to go to work. And that's what the system was made for. And it hasn't changed fundamentally since 1900. The school system is set up to create an industrial revolution style electorate or citizenry. That's what it's built for. So you learn reading, math, reading, writing, arithmetic, right? You learn how to balance your checkbook, was like in the basis of the education system then. Now people have to go to college if they want to have lifetime earnings. This education system we have, K through 12, is not built for college. It's not really built for that. The tests that we have at the state level are all diffuse. None of them are the same. We don't have a national system, which would be what you need for like a college-based trajectory where you're saying, okay, you're K through 12 and everybody goes to college, well, then you'd have to have a national system of education that said, hey, our standardized test for college is the standardized test. There are no other standardized tests. That's the one. And then everything that you do from K through 12 is building towards that test. That's not what we have, right? So then you have a very disparate situation between kids, and it's all based on material resources. So it doesn't particularly matter how good your teacher is or even how good your school district is. It only really stratifies down to how much money you have, how much security and safety you have, how your housing situation is, how much trauma you've seen in the household, adverse childhood experiences is what determines your success in school. And I saw that in every single city I worked in. It was always the same. And a mismatch between what the purpose of education was in turn of century, 20th century, and what the purpose of education needs to be today is misaligned.
So before we further tumble down that rabbit hole of education, I just want to bring it back briefly to how education informs, to Peter's point, our ability to learn, our ability to communicate, our ability to argue in these many voices that are at the table. I think something that we used to talk about a lot on the old radio show is if there should be more regulatory institutions in the journalism space. I'm still thinking about what Don Lemon was suggesting, which is that there needs to be more vigor and more volume and maybe more velocity of arguments from the people who did not vote for the conservative leader, for Trump, and did vote for either Kamala or Joe. And I'm also considering, what Peter has said, which is that if we live in a world where everyone is constantly at each other's throats, and I'm thinking about this because you invoke the terminology mediation, Reg, even though I'm not a mediator. I'm the kind of person who will click on a fight video on Twitter to go, I didn't delete Twitter when everybody else did, to go like, what they fighting about? Meanwhile, I'm, this respectable, white collar shirt wearing guy, or at least I try to play one on TV. And I think it's ruining me. I think it's stressing me out. And so between the three of us, where are we on, I think per what Peter said, Reg, what do you think about Don Lemon's, interpretation of journalism, of media, of non-traditional journalism? Look, they're not barred and associated and regulated in the same way that, you lawyers are. Rudy Giuliani was ridiculous on the mic regularly, and he was disbarred in places, right? Does that happen to journalists? And should it, not say you have a rigorous answer for this, but I mean, these are the kind of things that I'm considering, because one reason I'm willing to rap with y'all is because Peter's like, we need to be having these conversations. Number one. Number two, if I tell myself in my head I'm just talking to friends as I would on the phone, then I can make it through it. But it is killing me. Like, if anyone knows, like, my face is breaking out right now. I had a whole nervous breakdown last Monday. Went to the doctor, and they were like, these are the physical reactions to you having a panic attack. I was laying in the bed. I thought I was laying down rested. I was apparently going crazy from the headlines, from everyone talking about what's going wrong. If anyone's not familiar with my bio, my work is directly tied to whether we can deliberately include people and price it. The economist in me wants to tie a price to the lack of inclusivity, to all corporate disagreement, and incentivize more people to participate in a normal economy. But we got to do a few things that we're talking about here. We got to educate people enough where they know how to think and participate in a new world, which Reg is saying we are not designed for yet. We also have to be able to mitigate the risk of arguing internally in any kind of organization, institution. And the engineer / economy in me wants to know if we can systematize that, rate it, and price it so that we can duplicate it across the globe. Or do we devolve into this Putin state where the most angry people with the biggest guns win, because we are trying to figure out how to be civil with them when all they want to do is shoot us after we're done with our rant. Did I fail to make that into a question? I think I did.
No, I just wanted to kind of let it sit there because it was kind of effective as a rant rather than as a question. I guess sort of my first thought is sort of tying it back to what Reg just said about sort of it's up to the individual, you know, the individual student basically as a representation of where they stand socioeconomically, that we just leave kids where they are, where they came into school socioeconomically, that's their fate. We don't have a system that actually helps move them across the socioeconomic spectrum. So I just the reaction to that, into the this journalism of combativeness. It's like, how do we move away from this individualistic approach where it's like, good luck to you, small child, welcome to the rest of your life, where school is just essentially a proxy for all the other competitions in life. It's not actually a preparative space. It's not an educational space. It's not a cooperative space. It's just your first introduction to, this is a cutthroat world. This is what you brought to the table. Good luck to you. See you later. Like, how do we, because we clearly have parents who are all aligned saying, our kids are not being prepared. They're not being cooperatively, hooked together. Like, to use the classic metaphors, like, I think the question is, how do we politically, because I think, Reggie would say we know better ways to run schools. Like, it's not like that no one has ever thought of how to better, run a school, administer a school. But we have these political conflicts within this country that prevent us from implementing what are sort of basic best principles in terms of education that seem to be established in other places and around the world. So the question to me is that, again, is how do we successfully stand up for ourselves in this moment, but also teach some sort of theory of we're all in this together, because we are a country, and to some degree we do rise and fall with each of us together. We are linked together. Boats are chained together. We do rise and fall as the tide swells and falls. But and in theory, that should be something an educational system should be able to instill in people. But if it is so completely distinct, and folks don't feel like they're actually in this together at all, like how do we both remedy the situation we're in now and make sure that we don't drown, and then also try and build something that works in the long term to actually make a cooperative machine out of us as a nation instead of a competitive situation? I don't have an immediate answer, but I guess I would ask Reg, in places you have been, have you found lifeboats that work for people to be able to, are there communal, what's mutual aid strategies that parents can work together on in terms of trying to provide group childcare, or a space for all their kids to learn together? I'm just sort of thinking, if we are at the point where it is down to individual parents trying to group together and find solutions, have you found little practices that work along the way, or professionally with teachers working together, strategizing new ways?
Yeah, it's all unsustainable. So the private school, I mean, that's existed. That's the first thing that the country started doing, right? Well, as soon as the Confederacy was ended and the war ended, they started making schools that would teach an alternate, reality of education, and they used that to infiltrate the public education system in the North and decide that this was a war between the states, not a war over slavery or not slavery. And that persisted for about 75 years across education. So, parents and advocates, they've been doing that for a while, finding enclaves to get across their singular mission, their individualistic mission that they wanted to impose on the education system. Nowadays, it's charter schools, which I was a part of, and almost all the institutions I worked at were charters, where you have a board that has a vision, getting public dollars, and enticing a very specific group of people, in most cases, low income, or people who are considered low income, and or families that are on free and reduced lunch, because that's how you get the most dollars. And so you had this monolithic group of sorts, or certainly homogenous group of Black and brown children in schools. And that's what's kind of made the school system very segregated, because, the more money you can get for free and reduced lunch, and then that's tied to race and what's happened in the country over the last 300 years, income and economics are tied to race. And so it may not be racialized in that they only want Black kids to be in the school, but by structure, a lot of these charter schools that are getting those results are getting those results because they're getting well over the funding amount. They get subsidized by the public, and then they go and fundraise for the rest, and they put all the kids on the same footing resource-wise. And that's how they're able to make gains. It's unsustainable because the teachers work longer hours. They get paid to work those longer hours. It burns you out. It's very insular. You're killing yourself to try to overcome the economic issues kids are having, the work that parents have to do working 2 or 3 jobs so they can't read with them at home, which we know are the ways for kids to get better literacy. They can't engage in the school, which is ways to make the school better. So they already do that. That's already happened. People have individualized in their states. We see that battle in Texas. We see the battle in Florida. They have done that. Is that the right way for our kids to be brought into the 21st century or for them to be successful? I think you can feel it across the country. It is not. We want something that is across every state, across every county. You go there, you get the same amount of money. You go there, you at least get the same education. We agree on the same principles of the education we're teaching. And right now it is 51 different states and 5,000 different jurisdictions.
So wait. So I think the last thing you just said is interesting per, Peter's question. Are you suggesting, because then I have a question on top of that parents across different locales, let's go to your Miami, Chicago, LA, New York, and everywhere in between, would like a standardized, unified approach to what is education? You're suggesting that, because, and I hear you. I think I hear that too when I'm in the middle of nowhere half time. I'm in Michigan and Colorado and Missouri and Texas and Maryland and you name it. You're saying parents want a unified way, unified understanding, even though we're in a clandestine war between states' rights, which we all know per the Civil War is not about states' rights, but or at least
that's what people want.
Okay.
Again, the people who control school districts, the people who make the decision about education is a very small group. It's the most engaged. It's the people with the most resources and time to be engaged. And what do you know? Those tend to be people with money whose kids are either in private school or going to go to private school. Yes. And so, that's what's happening.
So quickly on that, because I want to go into the higher education bubble, but it makes me think about, and again, as I am trying to figure out whether we should even be doing this, having this conversation in public right now, I'm constantly trying to figure out, are the added lanes, the added diversification of communications necessary? And I think about my own core philosophical holdings and how they hold up in this new world. I'm trying to figure out, the economist in me is trying to figure out if we can manage the incentives to participate well in society, whether that happens to influence journalism or education or finance or you name it. And I think about what you just said, and Peter, consider this with me. What I normally say at the beginning of every show, which is the elaborate jazz of inclusionism, which is that individuals are at their best when they identify with the community. These are your charter school collectives and the daughters of the Confederacy who are making all the schools after 1865, or really like 1895. But anyway, there's that. There's how we sustain ourselves by being in community, and we have some common language there always. But then the latter part of my stance in inclusionism is that communities are only at their best when they identify all of their individuals, which is this me alluding to the constant hack of individuals self-identifying. And I'm with Peter. I don't think a running over of individuality has provided any real, sustainable quality of life. As I go crazy, I realize that my family and my small community are what really give me peace and prop me up, not anything, of material or whatever feedback I'm getting online. But my individuality in that niche, in that small group, in that community, in that charter school, makes it as valuable as it is, but I have to be seen. I have to be allowed to say, you know, we need to further define this term. I have to disagree. We need to differentiate. The richness of those communities require individuals to gradually come out about, you know, whatever they are, whatever new thing they've learned, whatever opposition they have to the agreed upon standard of what, you know, the science, you know, the science of the day is. And so I'm constantly, I'm doing this podcast, you know, differently than Joe Scarborough. I want everything you all say to make me reconsider everything I've ever thought, because I'm at this point in life in my mid 40s questioning how it's supposed to work. And so you saying that parents want, and I get it, it's about ease of engagement. A standardized way to do education, I think, is interesting. I haven't heard that before. I don't have any kids. I think one reason I'm ignorant about the education system and the medical world is because I don't have any kids in the education system. I sort of lucked my way through it. If I think about my own history, and with regards to the medical stuff, I neglect myself. So those two things make me an ignorant bastard. But so you're confirming that everybody wants the same play, whether they're in Kansas, Florida, or New York.
Everyone would like to agree on how to learn. They're never going to agree on what to learn. I don't think we ever will agree we all should learn what we all should be learning, but the how. All parents think that their kids should leave school knowing how to read and how to solve problems, how to work collaboratively, and how to share, and how to stand up for other people. Parents across the board want the how.
And so, Peter, does that mean we have to start a school and talk to people?
Well,
I think it's political to what Peter said. Yeah. It's the political means to that outcome. Politically, you'd have to change the structures of the education system and focus in on how do we want our kids to learn in the United States? How do we want them to learn? Do we want them to learn for the purposes of going to college? Because college education is very different than your senior year in high school. So, you know, if that's the goal, then you would take a lot of standardized tests out. And you say the how to learn is really about collaboration and projects and working together. And so it doesn't really matter how far you get into projects. And what to learn, you must know how to read. You must know how to write. You must know how to persuade. You must know how to speak in small groups or to people and communicate in a civil manner. That's really easy to do. If that's all educators had to do is teach people how to read, how to write, how to persuade, etc. That's not what they're tasked with doing.
What are they tasked with doing? What else are they doing?
They are tasked with ignoring where people are coming into a school. You are to ignore that the kid hasn't eaten. You're to ignore that the kid does not have a home when they go home. You're to ignore that they need mental health services because they have to get a certain test score. They have to read on a certain grade level by a certain time. They have to be able to do a certain math equation or formula. They have to have read these certain texts by this age. When you make the what to learn so efficient, it's about, you know, what percent of the people will do blah, then you're taking away the how to learn. How do you learn how to be a good citizen in the United States? How do you learn how to deal with conflict? That is not an objective in any school.
Wait, Peter, what were you about to say?
But it's not something you could test.
I was laughing because you were going to feel attacked on the efficiency angle because I think
I like that.
I know, but I think that I agree that that this is something that has attempted to be standardized, that has attempted to be like commodified in one size fits all, in the idea that that is somehow like egalitarian or equal or something like that, which is at least the justification that people slap on it, you know. When they're pointed out that, hey, this produces really disparate results across different groups and different places, different times, they're like, but look, we're trying to treat everyone equally, and that's sort of the goal of the United States. It's like, yes, if we were a brand new country where everybody suddenly arrived here at the exact same moment with the exact same resources, the exact same history and experiences and family, you know, resources and family histories, but we're not. We're a country that has attempted to put together a truly unprecedented group of people across different places, times, and regions, and cultures, and religions, and beliefs, and resources, and economic abilities, and racism and sexism and like homophobia. We are trying to squeeze all of these things, and as Reg points out, we so try and say that stuff doesn't exist when you get into school. Like you'll just get the same treatment as everybody else, and it'll be fine. And it's like that's sort of the original problem with America is that we have this good ideal, but we're like, this is the easy. There's one quick fix. Like this rise of the one quick fix idea in the world is sort of it's prevalent throughout all of our histories that there's one quick fix instead of this is a complex cooperation problem, which it really is. This country is a complex. It's truly the most complex cooperation problem that's probably ever been attempted in humankind. It's to try and take somewhat different folks and say we can make a successful go of this as a collective. But and then to get back to your point about this show, like that was my idea, is that there needs to be more beacons out there, more voices, more communication channels, whatever, that are saying this is a collective cooperation problem that America is, and we're trying to solve for it. And we need to have that conversation in addition to all the other conversations, because if we don't have that conversation, we are missing a really fundamental aspect of what this country is. And every other conversation is bound to fail if we do not address America is a giant collective cooperation problem, because it just, as Reg points out, it's everywhere in schools. Like you cannot standardize, you cannot commodify, you cannot one size fits all, because this is a collective of different people. And this is why the American like educational system feels like it's failing to all these parents across the different places, because it's failing to address this really basic issue, and it's pretending like aggressively like it doesn't exist. And so there need to be people who are saying, wait a second, this problem does exist. Let's talk about it some way, shape, or form. That's why I've been pushing you to have this podcast back on the air, is because this meta-analysis at an engineering level has to be happening. Like we're having all these teeny little like one silo conversations about how do we fix education, as though education were just a single standalone thing that could be addressed individually as opposed to part of a larger complex cooperative problem. So that's the reason this podcast needs to exist.
I hear you. I think even you're right. So sure, right. Well, we're here. But I'll also say, yeah, I think one of the most difficult problems is we don't have the language to talk about the what versus the how. Like for instance, I was recently in DC having an argument with people at the Human Rights Campaign about their logo, which if anyone is not familiar is a big equal sign. And they were people who presented me with this book, Conscious Capitalism, which I think is a terrible book, but it's old, so it's fine. It's like 2014. And it talks a lot about egalitarianism and equality, two words I cannot stand because I don't think that they're possible. And so our logo at Inclusion Score, and the conversation I was having with these people about conscious capitalism at the Human Rights Campaign in DC was about the fact that true equality, true egalitarianism can exist because we come to the table of cooperation, to use Peter's word, from different spaces. And so we should just be talking about equity. What does James need versus what Peter needs versus what Reg needs to participate well? And if we're not talking about that, which seems to be the word that people are most terrified of, I think about the Society for Human Resources Management, which attempts to be the risk manager pre-mediation at every organization across this country and across the globe, whether they're a government, a corporation, a for-profit, a university, a nonprofit, you name it. I had a series of arguments there as they were like, we want to delete the term and the consideration of equity. And I was like, that's the only thing that we should be considering as we attempt to include people and solve for belonging, which again, per Reg's point, will look different at every place. I think when people see me coming in as the inclusion score guy with the blue suit on, this guy's getting ready to tell us that there's a one size fits all method to include people. And that's exactly the opposite of what we do. We try to give people a system to identify, again, the individuals in their organization, seek feedback mechanisms from them, or build feedback mechanisms, for them, so they can figure out what things they implement equitably in their space. Not in a quality way, because again, we may all need different things to participate well or cooperate well in a particular organization. And so anyway, I'm here, so I agree with you, Peter. But that said, on the Reg's work in considering how the collective distributes the not only the what education is, but how to or what to include. I should say not what education is, but what to include in it, like those basic things. But then how we distribute it. I think know that they will be different. When I think back to the Don Lemon conversation we were having earlier, I am starting to lean towards it being necessary, to being of the group that thinks it is necessary to differentiate all these communications about how we educate people in the what, in those basic subjects, because people will want to receive them differently. And I've seen it in politics. I've seen two politicians saying the exact same thing, two corporate leaders saying the exact same thing, but because their faces look different, the core constituency, the people that they're trying to talk to, are willing to receive the message differently, which is why I think, so many people felt. I'll tell you, back to the earliest conversation we were having, and then I know we're running over time, but I want to run into this higher education issue that Reg and I were talking about earlier offline. When I saw Obama laughing with Donald Trump, what I immediately thought about was code switching, and how many times I've sat and laughed with somebody that I totally despise, or that I know despises me. And I thought about how I felt in 2008 or 2007 or before about Obama's accent, and being a certain type of Black man from a certain type of place from the Midwest who went to a certain type of school, the schools that he went to. I remember when my voice deliberately sounded different. Like, it's taken me 44 seasons to walk into sounding like this version of James, which I'm not even sure is the original one, the one who wanted to be a member of Bone Thugs Harmony and be a rapper. But right, I like the eye roll, Rick. But again, different place, Midwest, not the. Would you consider Paducah? Is that the South or is that Midwest?
Where there are slaves, it is the South.
Okay, there you go. So anyway, it's a great answer, by the way. But anyway, all I thought about was the code switching, and I remember speaking to a group of colleagues at the National Science Foundation who were talking about our international standard for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And in a candid moment, they were like, I'm not sure that we can incentivize people to leverage this standard to include folks, and that we can actually change organizational culture. And my response to them was, we're not asking everyone to radically change the culture of the communities that they fit into, but we are asking them to code switch a bit when they come to work. In a portion of community, and we do this not only here in the United States, we do it in India, we do it in Latin America, we do it in Europe. There's a majority class from a power standpoint, not always a population standpoint, because I think about South Africa, where people are still conforming to a minority group that runs that particular country, at least economically. There is a comfortability of the majority class or caste in organizational culture in corporate world that is failing the code switch. And what I said to these mostly white women at the National Science Foundation, it's like, we're just asking people to code switch a bit when they come to work, not slap women on their asses, not, over caricaturize people from other cultures. And I was like, I've been doing that my whole life. And I always think about Barack Obama when I do that. I've been dulling my regular accent and thoughts about the world, because as we all do, we try to just fit in, let our intellect run its course, and not let our sort of culture spill over. And all I saw with him laughing with that old man was the version of me that worked in the auto industry in the early 2000s, who was just trying to get along with dudes who thought I didn't belong there. at all. And it made me angry. Among all the other headlines and videos of that week, which I think was about a week ago, and I think that's ultimately what gave me the panic attack, which drove me crazy as I sat in the bed and tried to act like it didn't exist. And Peter, you're right in going, it does, and maybe we need to talk about it. So my frat brothers called me like, you need to talk to somebody. And I'm toxic, so I was like, I ain't gonna talk to nobody. But now we're here. I guess I'm talking to y'all. This is kind of therapy. But that said, as we think about the differentiatable communication streams for education, and I try to wrap it on these series of thoughts. Reg, let's talk briefly about the pending bubble, or maybe the bubble that we're already here, that we're already on, with regards to higher education. We talk about secondary education or the kids under 18, but in this country, the president, I don't know if it's a good or bad strategy because I'm not an education professional, has talked about extending the 12 years of education to 16 or more. I know they made it specific to community colleges, but is any of that possible? Is it sustainable? Have we reached a ceiling in how we have the same conversation with 150 or 300 or so million people at once to have a streamlined culture? Like, are we even able to scale what we do in teaching people how to think? I'm going to assume that's what we're doing with education. Correct me if that language is a bit too frivolous, but have we reached a peak? Have we, and of being able to do that, being able to distribute education? I feel like we distribute culture via education, via conversations like these, but it takes a lot to get to even having these conversations like these. Are we at the end? Or is this system, can it be amended? Can it scale more? Can we consume more people? Can we acquire China and Europe? I don't know.
I will say, it's probably a conversation, if you'll have me again, to continue.
Yeah.
But how you distribute culture and how you distribute education is fundamentally different because
that is interesting.
Because one costs a lot and one does not. We are on this. I can get on a podcast. I can listen to a podcast virtually for free, and I can hear about other cultures, other people, etc., in an instant. But to become a owner of a Bachelor of Arts degree, you will have to spend $250,000. So if you're saying that education, in terms of dispensing, it would have to be at a low cost for it to be accessible to everyone. And one of the ways that our capitalist structure in higher education has done this is by saying, hey, we'll give you a blank check if you take out loans to go to any institution you want to go to. You can be 18 years, 16 when I went to college, but you can be 18 and you can put your name on a loan and they will give you $40,000 to go to this school. That's one of the ways we said, okay, how do we get access? How do we make it efficient and distributed? And then they said, well, we'll also subsidize state schools and smaller schools so that we'll give an incentive for people at the lowest levels of participation in education. These are the people who got the C average and graduated from high school. How do we give them access to a 4-year institution? We will say, hey, if you go to a state school, it's free or highly subsidized for you to go to a state school. Boom, right? This is how you get the efficiency out to get people to go to college. But there are several things that many podcasters have talked about, and I saw a recent 17-minute clip that I thought was excellent called The College Enrollment Crisis. After each recession from 1990, 1998, 2001, or 99, a bubble burst, and then real recession 2001, 2008, budgets for these state institutions, subsidies for these state institutions would drop, obviously so. And the institutions would say, hey, we're gonna cover that by raising the tuition. Yeah. And when the money comes back, hey, we won't raise the tuition anymore, or we'll be able to get that money back and then go back to what we were doing before. But that didn't happen. What happened is the budgets never go back to what they were before.
Right.
Dollar signs keep going up. the institution has to pay more, and so it needs enrollment. But then at the same time, in the last 40 years, we've had a decline in birth rates because it's too expensive to have kids. And so the enrollment crisis is going to impact the small institutions, the schools that are providing that 4-year education to the C+ student. Those are the places that no longer have the money, the endowment. So what they have to do is they increase their enrollment and they accept everyone. 60% of all 4-year institutions accept 75% or more of
That's
applicants.
a crazy number. I did not know that.
Now, it's not a bad number when you're saying only 10% of the population is applying. It's not a big deal. But when you need we need a lot of college graduates, so we need a lot more people. A lot more people are engaging in it. Certainly, proportion of the people born in 2000 or 1990 are certainly going to college, and that puts the pressure on the institution. So their bottom lines are in a deficit, even when they're raising the cost every single year, which is going to hit a bubble in the next 2 years, where we're going to see a quarter of 4-year institutions either go bankrupt or get consolidated or something. And the question that this particular podcast threw out there is students should no longer look at the rank of their school. They shouldn't even look at how much money it costs. What they really should be looking at is, will this institution exist in 50 years? And will my degree still have any value when I'm 45 or 55 years old?
Peter, have you heard this?
And that means that is fundamentally different than, can I access culture, right? That is a fundamentally different calculation that students will have to make, or enrollees will have to make over the next 10 years. Whereas I can just jump on there to Shade Room and I'll find a bunch of culture. Just one click away.
I like what you did with differentiating culture and education. You're right. I think I use those terms too interchangeably, because you're right. You also have to do a little bit of work. Not for that $250,000. You also have to come back based on the culture you received and write something, interpret something. You're learning through the rigor of trial and error, whether it's math or you're in the liberal arts or whatever. So note it. I stand corrected. I didn't know about this coming bubble. I haven't been thinking about this coming bubble. And you're right. When I talk to people about education, as I talked to my 14-year-old niece about where she wants to go to school, I was like, you want the best network, not necessarily the best state school. If I went to the best school I could have went to, it probably would have been Michigan State University. Go Greene, go right. But the best network I got was actually at the HBCU in Alabama, which we didn't know much about before I got there, but it has benefited me immensely. I know we're at the hour because I have to pee because I've drank this whole thing of chai tea. Peter, what do you think? Any final thoughts on Reg telling us that the core tenets of Americana are getting ready to fall apart in 24 months? I mean,
well, I mean, I guess it just speaks to the same issue that we've been talking about throughout, is that if America is a complex cooperative, problem to be solved, how do we actually put people in places to succeed? How do we make sure that they have spaces to live, food to eat, and then arts and entertainment and culture to consume? These are all sort of different aspects of this large complex cooperation problem, but they are different aspects of it. But I think we have to consider, the issues of how do we put people in places for a certain amount of time? Because I think, going back to something Red said at the beginning, that like schools are in some way, shape, or form a place for parents to park their kids so they can go and engage in economic activity. And that's just a reality of how our current world is organized, is that parents need time and space to go perform economic activities in order to bring in income, to survive, to raise their families, all that stuff. But we still treat education as though it's just this sort of standalone, magical, beautiful thing. We don't consider it as a practical reality of everyday life. And this is what's being pointed out by if there's going to be 25% of higher education institutions are going to disappear, to what degree does that disappear the credentials, the ability to get a job for these people who have attended that institution? You can't just knock out 25% of people's college degrees and say, hey, good luck to you. Go out there and try and get a job from school that people will never have heard of in 10 years time. And who will be like, oh, really? What is this? There's this really practical sort of material institutional aspects to all these conversations that need to be brought to the surface, that school is, as well as an educational and a cooperative place, it is something that parents need, because currently you need to be a double income, household. You cannot have one parent at home in charge of childcare for most people. It's just not feasible. It also is that, your college degree matters in your ability to get a job in the future. And if your college suddenly ceases to exist, what happens to you then? And then one piece that we didn't even get into that I wanted to get into is like, what happens when AI gets a little bit smarter as a large language model and starts to be able to automate a lot of processes that are currently people are being employed to do? Like, what happens to those people when the job that they were trained and accredited for no longer exists because it's cheaper and easier to have a computer do it than them? And these are huge coming complex cooperative problems that the United States is going to face that nobody's talking about sort of at that real high cultural level. And that's what I think this show can really serve to do, is to bridge that gap about these long-term problems, and how do we address them? How do we discuss them? How do we value them within our society? Like, do we just value people for what their productivity level is? Do we value them for their caring abilities? As Reg says, is we don't have a birth rate that's replacing people. We're going to have an aging population. Like, are we prepared to properly value folks who care for that aging population? Or is it going to be still, how cheaply can we get this done and screw everything else? And until we start thinking about America as this complex cooperation problem that has infrastructural, material, and cultural components that all interact with one another, we're not going to really have the conversation we need to be having, which is, what do we want this country to look like? And what we heard from Reg is that we know the parents are dissatisfied with what education looks like. But despite this being apparently a prevalent problem across the country, there is no real political solution for that. In fact, this coming administration wants to shrink the federal Department of Education, which sounds like a crazy idea given the conversation we just had. But that apparently is the political direction of 78 million of us, apparently, supposedly. But maybe it's because these folks are not aware that if you shrink the Department of Education from its already pretty meager, stature to something smaller, maybe their school situation is going to get worse. And they hadn't thought about that, because they hadn't thought about how these boats are all tied together, how these different elements of this complex cooperation problem work together. So I hope we can have Reg back to keep unpacking these issues in a really sort of fundamental way, because I think that's what's lacking, is folks do not understand the way these pieces interact in their daily lives, and they end up in situations that they don't like, and they agree with a lot of other people that they don't like them, but they don't know how to cooperate politically in order to resolve them. And I think that's kind of what I hope this show is about, is trying to show folks you can cooperate with people with whom you do not think you have a lot in common, but you actually may have a whole heck of a lot more in common, and that you may have the same problems that need to be addressed. And maybe with a representative group of voices on the show, to your point about how different audiences are receptive to different, presenters, maybe that is a key, is to have a diversity of representation in making these kind of arguments and these, presentations and these persuasions. So I don't know. I'm just saying, I think this is a conversation that needs to continue for a long time, because it hasn't been happening.
All right, Reg, you got to come back. You got to let us know when your calendar is open so we can figure it out.
I know you got to go. Can I say this one thing?
No, go. I don't got to. I'm just holding it in.
You asked me, what am I an expert at? I think I'm an expert at people. I'm not, I could say that I'm an expert in education. Sure. I know a lot about education, know a lot about the law. I know a lot about prosecution. I know a lot about crime. I know about society, but I know a lot about people, because for the last 20 years, my job has been going into folks' living rooms, into their garages, to their places of work, having them confronted with a very difficult problem. Their child is not doing well in school. There's been a claim of abuse. We need to get these contracts for this homeless shelter to exist. There's been a rape. There's been a serious crime, and now we have to handle it. Or somebody squandered $400 million on a pension fund, and now we need to settle the case. In all those different spaces, it's all been about, how do you communicate to people what the problem is, get them on a shared language, and understand what their value is for it, and come up with a solution that everyone in that dispute or that problem finds worth their time. And so I really do have a keen sense of people and problem solving. I just know a little bit about everything so that I'm more effective at doing it. And I hope that I can come back on the show in many different regards beyond just education. But I think education is the core of what leads people to doing right by society and themselves. When people know that they can trust the person that's giving them information, and they can trust what that information is, they are much more willing to tell you what the value of that information is to them.
True. Yeah, I think trust is a cornerstone. I think, yeah. Anyway, in any good relation, I used to use this when I had my last breakup, the marriage before the marriage. I was like, a good relationship, whether it be, intimate, romantic, or just, whatever, professional, I think there's an attraction. There's a reason we're there. I don't mean physical attraction. Not always, not in every relationship. There's respect. And then there's trust. And at any point that any one of those three things break down, the relationship is not formidable enough to exist well. Anyway, in my last relationship, I didn't respect her well, and she didn't trust me as a result, and it fell apart. And so I think, we need to figure out how to have these conversations about institutions, institutional frameworks that people can trust, build respect upon, so that we can distribute them the solutions that we need. But in order for them to probably respect and be attracted to these systems that foster trust at all, they probably have to see and hear faces and voices that they already want to receive it from. Some people will be willing to receive what we're talking about, and then other people, probably far, far away from us. We all live here in New York, in Harlem specifically. There'll be other folks like, I don't want to know what them Harlem people think, those city slickers or whatever. Do people still say city slickers? Anyway, so yes, thank y'all. Let's definitely do this again. I know we will do it again. Reg, you're officially adopted as a regular part of the show, so send us your regular schedule. But we'll do it again. Thanks everybody for joining us here. We're at the hour and a half mark, or just under it. Wow, my mind is blown. I got a page full of notes here, and hopefully this doesn't stress me out more. Peter, I feel like there's more work to do now than anyway. Thank y'all. Anything? Okay. All right. Well, I'll see y'all soon. All right, everybody.